Congressman, it's always so good to have you on the show and to see you. Let's talk about the fact that today President Biden on the ground in that state of Georgia announcing the fact that he has these big endorsements from political groups representing communities of color. How critical do these communities remain in helping Biden to get across that finish line in November?
Incredibly critical. And here's the thing, it's one thing to receive an endorsement from an organization. It's another thing to receive an endorsement from three leading organizations that are saying, not only will we endorse the president, but we're going to put $30 million behind ensuring that we deny Donald Trump a second term and that we reelect President Joe Biden. And I think that just shows, number one, what's at stake in this election, but especially what's at stake in this election for our AAPI community, for our Black community, for Latinos, and for people of color, marginalized communities across this entire country. Many people who won't survive another Donald Trump term, and that's not hyperbole. And so I think this just shows, again, what the stakes are this November.
So I thought you were the perfect guest to be able to play this part of President Biden's latest campaign ad, just came out, where he briefly touches on his age.
Look, I'm not a young guy. That's no secret. But here's the deal. I understand how to get things done for the American people.
So Congressman Biden leaning in on his age as being a positive. But do you think that this messaging works for him as he continues his outreach to younger voters?
I think this is the right messaging to have. And this is something I've been saying for a while, ever since people have been starting to talk about his age in the media and across polling and et cetera, is voters and especially young people want authenticity. They don't want people who will brush aside an issue and say it's not an issue, or brush aside something and say it's not, something I don't want to talk about. The president leaning in and saying, yeah, I'm an old guy. That's okay, though. My ideas are new, and what I'm fighting for is new. And if you look at Donald Trump, not only are we pretty much the same age, but his ideas are so much older than the both of us, because he wants to bring us back to a time that nobody wants to go back to. And I think leaning in and acknowledging that it is a concern for some people, but it shouldn't be the top concern, I think is really important. Because at the end of the day, I think people, when they're in that voting booth, are less likely to think about age and more likely to think about who's going to protect my right to choose, who's going to protect abortion, who's going to fight to end gun violence. And obviously the choice is clear between Donald Trump and Joe Biden on who's going to do that.
Yeah, and I wanted to stick with this for just a second, because I read somewhere that the youth voters are saying, quote, we're giving him, as in Biden, the answers to the test, as in why, if we're sending all of these clear messages to Joe Biden about what's important to us, like, why can't he just do these things to make our job easier and his job easier? But doesn't that kind of oversimplify things by saying, if you do this, President Biden, you're just going to win our vote?
There's never a silver bullet, right, with any kind of voting base, especially young voters. You have to have continued action and continued work that you're doing. I remember there was a week last year where we heard about two amazing things from the administration, both the first Federal Office of Gun Violence Prevention and then the American Climate Corps, two really big priorities of the youth movement to end gun violence and defeat the climate crisis. And so hearing the president uplift those two things in the State of the Union, I think, is really important. And then hear him talk about what we need to do next to defeat the climate crisis and gun violence is also really important. It's not one action here that's going to win the youth vote, right? I actually would say it's kind of disrespectful to young people to assume there's one thing somebody can do. It's continued action, solidarity, listening, and fighting with these groups that I think is really important. And I think we've seen that from the president on many different issues.
Yeah, and to that point, right, you talked about climate control action that was done by the Biden administration, a win. Student loan debt, a win for the Biden administration. One thing that you worked on with Joe Biden hand in hand was the Office of Gun Prevention Violence. That's the first in the White House. That's an important issue. Reasonable, common sense gun control legislation. How important is it for all Americans, though, to make sure that in 2024, somebody like Joe Biden is back in the Oval?
Incredibly important. And let's talk about the office. For the first time in our country's history, our country has a White House, a federal Office of Gun Violence Prevention. We've never had this. It was the first bill I introduced. The president took that, implemented it in the executive order. My city of Orlando, Florida, got $1.5 million because of the advocacy of that office and my office through the bipartisan Safer Communities Act to save lives. And we're seeing that gun violence in cities across the country has actually been coming down a little bit, and we have a lot of work to do. If Donald Trump is elected, he will get rid of the office on day one. And so if we want to see that office expanded, if we want to see things like the Civilian Climate Corps expanded, we know what we got to do. And I said this the other day in an interview, and I'll say it again. If there's something that maybe I have a disagreement with the president on, and I send him a letter on it, I'm going to get a response from the administration. I'm going to get to make my voice heard and work with them on it. If I send that same letter to President Trump, he will wipe his ass with it. Those are the two options we have.
Congressman Maxwell Alejandro Frost, always delivering the truth. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. And joining me now for more flavor on this 2024 race, Tara Setmayer, Senior Advisor at the Lincoln Project, former GOP Comms Director and resident scholar at the UVA Center for Politics. Tara, let's talk about what happened on Super Tuesday this week. We saw further protest votes for Biden's support for Israel in the war in Gaza, 19% uncommitted in Minnesota, 12% no preference in North Carolina, and 9% in Massachusetts. And now ahead of Tuesday's Georgia primary, there's this Leave It Blank campaign that is urging voters to submit blank ballots. I mean, I have a personal opinion on how foolhardy this is, but putting that aside, will these protest voters come back into the fold, do you think, come November?
I would hope so, because they're only cutting their nose to spite their faces by staying home or voting third party in November. President Biden is making an honest effort. This administration is making an honest effort to try to help solve a very complicated problem. This is something that's been going on for a very long time. So do they honestly think the alternative of a President Donald Trump would help their cause any more than Joe Biden? No, they wouldn't. So I understand that this is very important to a lot of people, but the protest vote stuff, this time around is just the potential consequences for that are just too great, and it would hurt their ultimate goal. So I would hope that they would come back in November. They can do what they want now, but November really is the vote that counts.
You and I have to talk about Senator Katie Britt from Alabama. Her rebuttal, I don't know what we're going to call it, speech, drama club edition, whatever we're going to call it, that Republican response live from her kitchen, not as well received as Joe Biden's State of the Union speech. It's been ridiculed as strange, bizarre, and even conservative, Megyn Kelly calling it cringe. How much of a fumble was this for Republicans?
Well, I actually think that she was on par with the Republican Party today. I mean, it didn't surprise me that the decision to put a young woman back in the kitchen as the backdrop for a rebuttal to the State of the Union was their choice. Of course. I mean, they're setting women back decades with their policies now. So they're trying to be cute to do kitchen table issues, but that's just so yesterday. That's like 10 years ago with making that presentation. Put her anywhere else. I mean, women have been fighting to get out of the kitchen for decades. So she was... Cringe is a great word. It was cringe. It was embarrassing. I don't know what drama club would accept her, except maybe the Christian Nationalist Broadcast Network. I mean, that's about where that type of very odd, just everything about it was odd and strange, and just gave me chills to think that this is who the Republican Party thinks, and how she presented it. They think that was great. Not only that, she was just completely disingenuous with a lot of the things that she said. My husband and I were watching it again together, and he was listening to this hellscape of a country she was describing. And my husband went, "What country is she talking about?" Like, what is she talking about? America's actually doing pretty well. And for her to sit there and try to paint this picture, it was completely disingenuous, on top of the fact that she used a story about sex trafficking that actually took place 20 years ago in Mexico by a woman who has had a career as an advocate against sex trafficking, and testified in front of Congress in 2015 about her story. This didn't happen under President Joe Biden. It happened under George W. Bush. So they're exploiting this issue because they know that it has a certain resonance, and there's been failures on the border, and we all acknowledge that. But President Joe Biden, and brilliantly did this, putting Republicans on the spot during the State of the Union, has negotiated a bipartisan deal that is one of the toughest immigration deals in decades. When I worked in Capitol Hill back in the day, we would have loved a bill like this, and a lot of things would have been solved. But Republicans don't want to solve it. They want to continue to exploit stories like that, or stories about the tragedy that happened in Georgia, because they know it's a political winner for them, and most people don't know the actual facts about the situation. But it's Joe Biden that's trying to solve the issue, and Republicans who are not, because Donald Trump doesn't want it solved, because they'd rather exploit people for their own political gain.
Tara, I'm really glad that you fact-checked that Katie Britt representation that ended up being false about the sex trafficking, because that's really making the rounds on social media, and it's a lie that came from her. I wanted to quickly ask you in the little time that we have left about Trump, again, co-opting the system, right? It's kind of the kind of creation of a system that Trump co-ops, and we're going to talk about the RNC, an organization you know very well. Trump's daughter-in-law, Lara Trump, has now been elected on Friday as the co-chair of the RNC. Is this not just becoming the personal piggy bank for Donald Trump to ensure that the grift continues to grift?
Yes. I mean, it's been that for quite some time, but now it's like official, right? I mean, there's a Trump. They need to just take the RNC name off of it and just call it the TNC. It's the Trump National Committee at this point. And now that they've elected someone who's an election denier and as the chairman, and then someone who isn't qualified to, as my colleague Rick Wilson says, run the hot dog stand at 7-Eleven as the co-chair, the only qualification is that she's Donald Trump's daughter-in-law. She is going to go out there and be the face of the committee to raise money to pay for Donald Trump's legal bills. I don't give a damn what they tell you. That oh no, we're not. The RNC is going to make sure Donald Trump gets elected and work on other candidates. No, they're not. Okay. In the past, the RNC was about, yes, helping to get the president elected of their party, but also down ballot races. Who's going to give money to the RNC other than people who are pro-Trump? Because their money is going to go to be a slush fund for Donald Trump's campaign. And it's embarrassing. It really is. And, you know, go ahead, let them do it. If this is what the face of the party is now, I say good. The more we see of the insanity and the unseriousness of this party, the more the American people will realize the binary choice between Joe Biden, who's an adult and sane, and Donald Trump, who is insane, a malignant narcissist that has dictator fetishes and wants to tear up the Constitution. I think the American people will realize that that is not the future of the America that we want. There's more of us than them, I hope.